on this episode of The Ryan Vett Show.
Last week, the United States quietly minted its final penny. And when you trace the full arc from silent to boomer to X to millennial to Z to alpha, you begin to see that it wasn't just a 1-cent coin that became irrelevant. Each generation experienced the financial worldview of the one before it, challenges it, and often overcorrects for it, and eventually forces a recalibration.
And now, a reading from Ryan Vett's newsletter, Collide.
What the end of the penny says about the future of money. The oldest U.S. coin just slipped into history. Its quiet exit reveals how each generation has rewritten the value of money and why Gen Alpha and Gen Beta may never see cash, debt, or work the way we do. The American penny died on Wednesday in Philadelphia. It was 232, quipped the New York Times writer Victor Mather. Last week, the United States quietly minted its final penny. For most people, the news was not surprising nor earth-shattering. It was inevitable. The copper circle's demise did not take a futurist to predict the end of the useful life on the 1-cent coin. The penny was the longest produced U.S. currency in American history, and while I'm spewing trivia, the shortest, the 20-cent piece, lasted only 3 years of production. While the penny was not the first coin to be discontinued, its discontinuation does signal a fundamental shift. The finality of the penny reveals something more fascinating about the evolution of each generation's outlook on money. The story of American money, like most conversations, follows the generational pendulum. Each generation experienced the financial worldview of the one before it, challenges it, and often overcorrects for it, and eventually forces a recalibration. The penny's end is simply the latest arc in that swing. The silent generation, a scarcity mindset. The silent generation was frugal and, dare I say, stingy. The Great Depression defined their earliest memories with money. Bank failures were not cautionary tales told by grandparents, but instead were lived memories experienced firsthand by their immediate families. Money was literal, tangible cash, and, of course, pennies and other coins. Whatever you could hold was the only thing that you could trust. That cash, likely keeping their mattress firm, along with any assets, were in fact the entire representation of their wealth. Credit and mortgages of nearly any sort were not widely available for the silent generation in their prime spending years. Early home loans were typically short-term, 5-year notes with large balloon payments at the end, keeping home ownership out of reach for many working families. It was only after Congress authorized a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage for new construction in 1948 and then expanded it to existing homes in 1954 that home ownership began to open to the middle class. At that point, the members of the silent generation were children to young adults. The silents experienced the insecurity of those earlier structures, and it shaped their relationship with money for life. So they saved. They stretched, they scraped, and they raised children who would one day rebel against all of it. Boomers, the abundant life. Boomers grew up under the weight of frugality, surrounded by parents who stretched and saved and carried scars of scarcity long after the economy had moved on. And so, as the pendulum tends to do, it swung. The post-war boom wasn't simply an economic expansion, it was a philosophical one. Factories that had once produced munitions transformed into assembly lines for microwaves, televisions, and automobiles. Wages rose, suburbs sprawled, and two-income households became more common. And in 1958, the Bank Americard, what we now call Visa, began normalizing the idea that borrowing was not a mark of desperation, but a path towards the possibility and fulfilling the American dream. Boomers embraced it fully. They earned, they spent, they upgraded. They were not being reckless. They were challenging their parents' deprivation and overcorrecting towards plenty. One unique thing they continued from their parents is that they collected. They filled their homes with china and silver, furniture sets, commemorative plates, and more than a few things no one has known what to do with since 1994. Gen X, the Skeptical Realists. Gen X grew up watching the accumulation of bigger houses, nicer cars, and more, well, for lack of a better word, stuff. And they often viewed this from the empty living room after school while both parents worked. They saw the abundance, but they also sensed its fragility. The crashes of 1987 and the recessions of the early 1990s arrived at formative moments, and promises of stability felt less like a guarantee and more like a gamble. Some still remember the visceral experience of the credit card imprinter, the metal machine in the triplicate paper, that loud metal ka-chunk that captured your card number like a receipt of trust. They remember cashing checks in person, but they also remember being the first generation to experience online banking. They lived in two financial worlds, neither of which they fully trusted. Gen X challenged boomer abundance, pulled back from its excesses, and tried to recalibrate towards something more grounded. But they also entered adulthood in a time where college was becoming exponentially more expensive. They were leading the way of the student debt era, a trend that would explode among millennials. Millennials, continuing the overcorrection. When millennials came of age, the pendulum was continuing its overcorrection momentum. It was not swinging towards more things, but decisively away from them. They were continuing the generational overcorrection that began with Gen X's pushback against boomer abundance. The financial realities of massive student loan burdens, delayed homeownership, soaring rents, and the aftershocks of the Great Recession forced a different kind of calculation. College debt became normal, a nearly unavoidable cost of participation in modern economic life. By the mid-2010s, millennials had collectively carried over $1.5 trillion in student debt. So, millennials budgeted differently. They built their lives around monthly obligations rather than spending categories. As I previously written, they ushered in the subscription era where the question wasn't what can I buy, but what does my life cost every month? And culturally, they shifted a value from possessions to experiences. The desire stems from the way that they were raised. Millennials' parents were ever present, helicopter parents, trying to overcorrect their own childhood and upbringing as latchkey kids themselves. Gen Z, trending transactional. Gen Z continued the experience-based, minimal materialist worldview, but then they layered in a dimension, their digital nativeness. Money, for them, has never fully existed in a physical form. It is a number on a screen that moves at the speed of their thumbs. They can check their bank account or their Venmo balance at any point in time throughout the day and transfer money to friends without even touching cash or coins. They can buy fractions of stocks via platforms like Robinhood instead of spending $280 approximately for a single Apple share. They can spend just $1 and be a fractional shareholder. They can trade crypto, which is not based on any single economy. They can earn money tonight by delivering groceries and spend it an hour later on something meaningful to them. They expect money to be instant because nearly everything else in their world is. They view savings, spendings, investing, and earning as interchangeable verbs in a fluid financial ecosystem. Gen Z continues the pendulum momentum of overcorrection as we're nearing recalibration. Gen Alpha and Gen Beta, a true recalibration. Gen Alpha will likely be the first generation to bring the pendulum back towards the center. After decades of generational challenging and overcorrection, from boomer abundance to Gen X skepticism, from millennial minimalism and experientialism to Gen Z extending those same attitudes while moving even more transactionally, we will likely see the early signs of recalibration. Gen Alpha will enter adulthood during a time when artificial intelligence is reshaping entire sectors, much like automation transformed factory work for earlier generations. The shift will push many towards skill-based, blue-collar, and further extend the gig economy roles that pay directly for what they can do rather than the traditional corporate structure their grandparents pursued. And they will not see this as a downgrade. It will feel natural, even empowering. Gen Alpha, as we explored in an earlier essay, has already developed a remarkable spending power. In fact, Gen Alpha accounts for over $100 billion in influence today. They understand how money moves because they've watched it swirl around them from the moment they could swipe a screen. Yet, they will also value money more than their parents, though not as frugally as the silent generation. Their skepticism may feel familiar, echoing Gen X, but shaped by a global, digital, and deeply practical lens. Their millennial parents will have already cleared out the attics and basements of all the stuff left behind by boomers. Gen Alpha will have watched firsthand the emotional exhaustion that comes with settling estates, and they will have grown up in a home where subscriptions were often questioned, pruned, or canceled in favor for more intentional spending. As a result, their recalibration will likely be defined by a clean, almost minimalist financial posture, money as a tool rather than a signal. They will earn it when they need it, use it when it serves them, and move through the world with a lighter economic footprint than any generation before them. Gen Beta, however, may take this even further. If Gen Alpha is the recalibration, Gen Beta becomes the normalization. They will likely be the first generation to grow up in a world where physical currency barely exists, where digital wallets are the default, and where money is likely global and not tied to a single country's economy. They will inhabit a fully fluid financial ecosystem, one where earning is episodic and transactional. Value is defined by utility and mobility, and the gig economy is not a side hustle but the backbone of working life. To them, finding a penny on the ground will feel as novel and irrelevant as a millennial being handed a $2 bill. What the penny's end really means. The disappearance of the penny is not only about financial efficiency, it is a symbolic end of the last century in which money moved from scarcity to abundance to suspicion to subscription to transactional fluidity. Every generation experiences money, challenges it, overcorrects it, and then recalibrates it. And when you trace the full arc from silent to boomer to X to millennial to Z to alpha, you begin to see that it wasn't just a 1-cent coin that became irrelevant. The penny is symbolic of an evolving financial worldview shaped by each generation. Sometimes it's the smallest monetary denomination that can teach us the biggest cultural lessons. Thanks for listening to this reading of Collide. Until next time, I'm Ryan.
Thanks for tuning in to the Ryan Vet Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, comment, and like this episode. Plus, share it with someone who needs to hear it.